The January 6th House Committee is recommending criminal charges for former U.S. President Donald Trump. And among the crimes are obstruction of an official proceeding, aiding in an insurrection, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The referral is mostly symbolic, and it will ultimately be up to the Justice Department to decide whether to charge Trump. Today was the committee's final public meeting that was held, in which they outlined some of their reasons for their findings.
President Trump and his enablers repeatedly pressured state officials to take action to overturn the results of the election. The most dramatic example of this campaign of coercion was the president's January 2nd, 2021 call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which the president urged the secretary to find 11,780 votes he needed to change the outcome in that state.
The insurrection at the U.S. Capitol came weeks after Trump's efforts to overturn his defeat. Well, the committee also described how Trump riled up the crowd at a rally on the morning of the attack and did little to stop his supporters. And for more on this, I'm joined by John Misick, political analyst and editor at the Pennsylvania Capital Star. So, for the criminal referrals, 4 were made. First, what's your take on the charges and how serious are they?
Hi, Bakari. We are in uncharted and extraordinary territory here. President Donald Trump, in addition to being the only twice impeached president of the United States, is now the first president of the United States to have a congressional committee refer criminal charges against him to the Department of Justice. As you said at the beginning of this segment, that is largely a symbolic gesture. The Department of Justice is investigating already, and it will be up to Attorney General Merrick Garland to decide how or whether to proceed with this referral from the committee. I mean, the charges that have been that are being referred to DOJ are pretty serious and would, in a real universe, carry some pretty hefty jail time with them. Aiding and abetting insurrection, a conspiracy to defraud the United States, and the other 2 charges, all very serious criminal offenses. But again, it's entirely within the purview of the Justice Department to decide whether to proceed here.
Yeah, and I know this is uncharted territory. So what realistically do you see the DOJ doing with, this referral?
That's a great question. There have been people who have been complaining that DOJ has been dragging its heels with this investigation. But, if you watched the way the committee proceeded, Bakari, they built a very careful and cautious case and presented Attorney General Merrick Garland with the evidence that he needs to move forward if he wants to move forward. So now, armed with this, and he's no doubt been watching the proceedings and making very careful decisions, he'll have that many more arrows in his quiver if he chooses to proceed.
So, we also know that Trump recently announced his bid for president. How does this bode well, or how does this bode for that?
Again, the supporters of the president who are supporters of the president are all in. I mean, I felt today that the message was in a lot of ways for national and congressional Republicans, some of whom are already having buyer's remorse over the former president because of the performance in the 2022 midterms. This case presented sort of in its totality might be enough to convince Republicans to look elsewhere for a nominee come 2024. Whether or not that happens, of course, remains to be seen. But I did really feel like that was a carefully calibrated message to Republicans. I think also, Bakari, is a message to American voters. They were laying out, the committee was, for the history books today and to tell the story of what happened on that terrible day in 2021.
And John, what about the other Republicans mentioned, the key officials mentioned in all of this with the investigation, all the testimony that came out, text messages? Is there going to be any repercussion there?
Sure. We had 3 or 4 senior Republicans, including a Republican representative from Pennsylvania, Scott Perry, referred to the House Ethics Committee for refusing to cooperate with the committee. It's a great gesture, but I fear will be an empty one since the next Congress will be under Republican control, and they will be reticent or unlikely to proceed against their own members. But in terms of sending a message here about the gravity of the offense, I think that was definitely sent today.
So, this lasted for quite a long time. This was out there in the public, psyche, on media, CNN almost every night. Where does the pulse of the U.S. stand with this right now?
And I think at this point, unfortunately, public opinion is so cleaved that the people who believe the president is guilty believe the president is guilty, and those who believe he is not guilty of any wrongdoing believe he is not guilty. But I mean, there's that slender population of voters in the middle, somewhere between 10 and 12%, independents who tend to swing elections, who we saw, come over to the Democratic side in the midterms. They were perhaps listening more closely. And again, there are Republicans who may be suffering buyer's remorse for the former president, who also are listening closely tonight. But in terms of this sort of changing the direction of the ship of state, I'm not entirely convinced, but it was, again, a message, I think, for the history books.
And John, as we wrap up, lay out the next steps. What are we going to see unfold next few days, weeks, months?
It is now in the hands of the Department of Justice. The department properly does not talk about pending investigations. It does not tip its hand on how it intends to proceed. But people will be watching Attorney General Merrick Garland, I think, very closely for what he plans to announce, if anything, coming out of this investigation. The one thing that's important to note, Bakari, is that the window is fairly narrow. There's maybe 3 or 4 months at most into the new year before the primaries approach, then 3 or 4 months after the primaries before the general election approaches. And DOJ historically has stayed away from announcing anything too close to that electoral window. So there will be some pressure on Garland in the year, I think, to move forward on this if he's going to move forward.
John Misick, political analyst and editor at the Pennsylvania Capital Star, talking about the charges and, hey, what is going to happen next. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
You bet. Talk soon.